The sun cast long shadows over the rugged terrain of the Rocky Mountains, its golden rays dancing across pine trees and snow-capped peaks. Sarah, a 34-year-old wildlife biologist with auburn hair pulled back into a practical braid, crouched near a rocky outcrop. Her green eyes scanned the landscape for signs of wolf activity. She had spent weeks in these mountains, researching the delicate balance of the ecosystem. Clad in a weathered jacket and sturdy hiking boots, Sarah had grown accustomed to the unpredictable challenges of the wilderness. As she walked along a narrow trail, a faint whimper caught her attention. She froze, her heart quickening. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a cry of pain. Stepping carefully through the brush, she came upon a heart-wrenching scene. A wolf pup, its gray fur matted with dirt and blood, trapped in a steel leg-hold trap. The pup's wide amber eyes were filled with terror and exhaustion as it struggled weakly. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She glanced around cautiously, knowing the risks. "Who could have set this here?" she muttered under her breath, her voice a mix of anger and disbelief. She knelt beside the pup, careful not to startle it further. "Hey, little guy," she said softly, her voice soothing. "I'm here to help." Her colleague, Ben, called out from a distance. "Sarah, what's taking so long? We need to move before the weather turns." "I found a pup in a trap," she shouted back. "I can't leave him like this." Ben appeared moments later, his brow furrowed. A burly man in his late 40s, Ben was pragmatic to a fault. "Sarah, this is dangerous. The mother or the pack could be nearby. And you know what the regulations say." "To hell with the regulations, Ben," she snapped, her voice firm. "This is cruelty. I can't just walk away." Ignoring Ben's protests, Sarah pulled a multi-tool from her pack. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked to loosen the trap. The pup whimpered, flinching at every movement. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I've got you." The moment the trap released, the pup let out a small yelp but didn't move. Its leg was swollen and bleeding, the fur around it torn. Sarah gently scooped the pup into her arms, feeling its small body shiver against her chest. "We need to get him back to camp," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Ben sighed heavily. "Fine, but this is on you. If anything goes wrong." "Nothing's going wrong," Sarah cut him off. "Let's go." The trek back to camp was tense. The pup lay limply in Sarah's arms, its breath shallow but steady. Sarah couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. "Whoever set that trap has no regard for the pain they cause," she muttered. As they reached the camp, Sarah cleared a space in the medical tent, setting the pup down gently on a soft blanket. She cleaned the wound with antiseptic, her movements careful and deliberate. The pup whined softly, its trust in her evident despite the pain. "You're one lucky little guy," Sarah said with a faint smile. "I think I'll call you Ash, for the color of your fur." Ben stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "You know this is just the beginning, right? Keeping him alive is one thing. What happens when he's better?" Sarah looked up, her expression resolute. "One step at a time, Ben. Right now, he needs us." The night fell quiet around the camp, but Sarah remained by Ash's side, her thoughts racing. As she watched the pup sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling, she felt a growing sense of responsibility and an unshakable bond. The medical tent was dimly lit, with only the soft glow of a battery-powered lantern illuminating the space. The scent of antiseptic hung in the air as Sarah knelt beside Ash, her hands deftly cleaning the deep wound on his leg. Outside, the Rocky Mountains were shrouded in an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant howl of wolves. Ash's small body trembled with every touch, his amber eyes filled with a mixture of pain and trust. Sarah's voice was low and soothing. "I know it hurts, little guy, but you're safe now. I promise." Her hands, roughened by years of fieldwork, moved with a surprising tenderness as she bandaged his leg. Ben leaned against the doorframe, his face a mask of skepticism. "You're risking a lot for a wolf pup, Sarah. You know that, right? If the pack comes looking for him, or worse, if word gets out to the wrong people." Sarah shot him a sharp glance. "He's not just a wolf pup, Ben. He's a life. And if we don't do something, he won't make it." Ben sighed heavily and crossed his arms. Look, I get it. You've got a good heart. But this isn't like saving a bird or tagging deer. This is a predator. And predators come with risks. I'm aware of the risks, Sarah said firmly, her tone leaving no room for debate. But I'm not going to let him die because it's inconvenient. As the night deepened, Sarah stayed by Ash's side, her own exhaustion pushed aside by her determination to help him recover. She fed him small pieces of venison jerky soaked in water, his initial reluctance giving way to cautious acceptance. His tail, a small gray tuft, wagged faintly, a glimmer of hope in an otherwise grim situation. Hours later, as the camp settled into quiet, Sarah remained awake, keeping watch over Ash. Ben had retired to his tent, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The pup whimpered in his sleep, his tiny body curled into a tight ball. Sarah gently stroked his fur, her voice soft. You've been through so much, haven't you? But you're strong. Stronger than you know. The following morning, the camp was alive with activity. Researchers packed equipment, cataloged findings, and prepared for another day of fieldwork. Sarah, however, had a singular focus. She carried Ash to a shaded area outside the tent, setting him down on a blanket. The morning sun bathed the camp in a golden light, and the fresh mountain air seemed to invigorate the pup. He sniffed tentatively at his surroundings, his ears perking up. He's looking better already, said Ellie, a young intern who approached with a curious smile. I didn't think he'd make it through the night. Neither did I, Sarah admitted, a faint smile tugging at her lips. But he's a fighter. Ellie crouched beside them, her gaze softening. What happens now? Are you planning to release him back to the wild? That's the goal, Sarah said, her tone resolute. But not until he's ready. He still has a lot of healing to do. Throughout the day, Sarah worked tirelessly to ensure Ash's comfort and recovery. She consulted field guides and veterinary manuals, improvising treatments with the limited supplies available. Despite the challenges, her resolve never wavered. Ash, for his part, seemed to sense her care. He followed her movements with his eyes, his trust in her growing stronger with each passing hour. By evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the mountains in hues of orange and purple, Ash surprised Sarah by attempting to stand. His movements were wobbly and uncertain, but the determination in his eyes was unmistakable. You're full of surprises, aren't you? Sarah said, her voice filled with pride. Take it easy, Ash. We've got time. Ben watched from a distance, his expression a mix of admiration and concern. You've got away with him, he admitted grudgingly. But don't forget, he's still a wild animal. I haven't forgotten, Sarah replied, her gaze never leaving Ash. But right now, he's under my care. And I'm not giving up on him. As the stars began to fill the night sky, Sarah sat by the fire, Ash curled up at her feet. The bond between them, forged through pain and perseverance, was undeniable. And while the future remained uncertain, Sarah knew one thing for sure. She would do everything in her power to give Ash a fighting chance. The days that followed were filled with quiet determination and moments of unexpected joy. Sarah devoted herself entirely to Ash's recovery, balancing her research duties with the care of the fragile pup. Ash, for his part, seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. His leg, once swollen and raw, began to heal under Sarah's meticulous care. The pup's playful energy started to return, revealing a glimpse of the spirited creature he was meant to be. The camp, set against the backdrop of the Rocky Mountains, was a mix of rugged practicality and natural beauty. Tents were pitched in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, their needles carpeting the ground in a fragrant layer. A small stream wound its way nearby, providing fresh water and a serene soundtrack to the researchers' days. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the earthy scent of the forest. It was during one of these mornings, as Sarah prepared her notes for the day's fieldwork, that Ash proved just how much he had grown attached to her. The pup followed her every step, his bright amber eyes watching her intently. When Sarah crouched to tie her boot, Ash nudged her shoulder with his nose, eliciting a laugh. Well, aren't you persistent? She said, scratching behind his ears. His tail wagged enthusiastically, thumping against the ground. Guess I can't shake you off, huh? Ellie, the intern, passed by carrying a bundle of equipment. She paused, her face lighting up at the sight of the interaction. He's like your shadow, Sarah. It's adorable. Sarah smirked. He's more than that. He's different. There's something about him. He's not just another wolf. Ben, overhearing from the mess tent, chimed in with his usual skepticism. Careful, Sarah. You're anthropomorphizing him. He's still a wild animal, no matter how cute he looks. Sarah straightened, meeting Ben's gaze. He's more than that, Ben. You've seen how he follows me, how he reacts. There's intelligence there. Something deeper. Ben shrugged, clearly unconvinced, but Ellie grinned. I think it's sweet. Besides, haven't we all gotten a little attached? As the day progressed, Ash proved himself to be more than just a companion. While Sarah cataloged plant samples near the stream, Ash stood guard nearby, his ears twitching at every sound. When a rustle in the underbrush startled Sarah, Ash positioned himself in front of her, his small frame tense with a protective instinct far beyond his size. Looks like he's already watching your back, Ellie remarked later as Sarah recounted the moment. Maybe you've got yourself a little guardian. Maybe, Sarah replied, her voice tinged with pride. Or maybe he's just grateful. The bond between Sarah and Ash became the talk of the camp. Even Ben, who had been vocal about the risks, couldn't help but notice the pup's growing loyalty. One evening, as the team gathered around the campfire, Ben shook his head, watching Ash curl up at Sarah's feet. I'll admit it, he said grudgingly. He's got spirit. I didn't think he'd make it this far. Sarah smiled, stroking Ash's soft fur. He's a fighter. He reminds me why I do this work. Every life matters, no matter how small or wild. As the days turned into weeks, Ash's recovery was nearly complete. His limp became less pronounced, and his playful energy returned in full force. He chased butterflies in the clearing, darted through the trees, and even attempted to mimic the distant howls of his kind. The sound was more endearing than threatening, drawing laughter from the camp. You're getting there, little guy, Sarah said one evening, as Ash nuzzled her hand. Soon, you'll be ready to rejoin your pack. But even as she said the words, Sarah felt a pang of sadness. The thought of letting Ash go, of losing the connection they had built, weighed heavily on her. Yet, she knew it was the right thing to do. Ash belonged to the wild, and she had to honor that. For now, though, Sarah cherished every moment with the pup who had become her loyal companion. As the stars sparkled overhead, she sat by the fire, Ash resting against her leg, and wondered what the future held for both of them. It was a crisp morning in the Rockies when Sarah noticed something unusual. The camp had an air of quiet stillness, the kind that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Ash was unusually restless, his ears twitching at the faintest sounds. He paced the edge of the camp, his nose to the ground, sniffing the air with a focus she hadn't seen before. What's gotten into him? Ellie asked, watching the pup with a mix of curiosity and concern. He's been on edge all morning. Sarah tightened her jacket against the morning chill, her gaze following Ash. I'm not sure, she admitted, but whatever it is, he senses something we can't. Ben, emerging from his tent with a steaming cup of coffee, raised an eyebrow. Maybe it's the pack, he said bluntly. They could be close. The possibility sent a ripple of unease through Sarah. She had known this day might come, the day Ash's family would find him. She wasn't sure if it was fear or hope she felt. If they're here, we need to be careful, she said. Wolves are protective of their own. As the sun climbed higher, the tension in the air grew. Ash's behavior became more erratic. He darted between the tents, his ears pinned back and his tail low. Sarah knelt beside him, placing a steadying hand on his back. Hey, it's okay, she said softly. You're safe. Then, a sound broke the quiet, a low, haunting howl that seemed to echo from the surrounding forest. Ash froze, his body stiffening as his ears swiveled toward the source. A second howl followed, deeper and closer this time. The camp fell silent as everyone turned toward the tree. They're here, Ben said, his voice low. Sarah's heart pounded as she stood, her eyes scanning the forest. Moments later, shapes began to emerge from the shadows. 5 wolves, their forms sleek and powerful. At the front was the Alpha, a massive black wolf with piercing yellow eyes. His presence was commanding, his movements deliberate as he approached the edge of the clearing. Ash barked, a high-pitched yip that broke the stillness. The Alpha's ears flicked toward the sound, and he stopped, his gaze locking onto the pup. The other wolves hung back, their postures wary but curious. Sarah stepped forward instinctively, placing herself between Ash and the wolves. She could feel the weight of their stares, their wild intensity both awe-inspiring and intimidating. "Stay calm," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. The Alpha took a step closer, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Ash, emboldened by something primal, broke away from Sarah and trotted toward the black wolf. "Ash, no," Sarah called, but the pup didn't stop. The camp held its collective breath as Ash approached the Alpha. The older wolf lowered his head, sniffing Ash carefully. Then, in a moment that left Sarah stunned, the Alpha licked Ash's head gently, a gesture of recognition. "They know him," Ellie whispered, her voice tinged with wonder. Sarah's chest tightened with emotion. The Alpha's actions were clear. Ash was one of them. The other wolves began to approach cautiously, their curiosity overcoming their hesitation. Ash greeted each one with wagging tails and playful nips, his joy palpable. But just as relief began to settle over Sarah, the Alpha's gaze shifted to her. His yellow eyes bore into hers, and for a moment, she felt a wave of fear. Then, to her astonishment, the wolf lowered his head slightly, a gesture that felt almost like acknowledgement. Then, watching from a distance, let out a low whistle. "I've never seen anything like that," he said. "It's like he knows you helped." Sarah's voice was quiet, filled with awe. "Maybe he does." The wolves lingered for a while longer, their presence both a reassurance and a reminder of the wild world Ash belonged to. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the camp in twilight, the pack began to retreat into the forest. Ash hesitated, looking back at Sarah with a questioning gaze. "Go," she said softly, her voice breaking slightly. "It's your family." Ash took a few steps toward the pack, then stopped. With a final glance at Sarah, he let out a soft whine and turned to follow the others into the woods. Sarah watched until they disappeared, her heart heavy yet full of pride. Ellie placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You did an amazing thing, Sarah. You gave him a chance to find his family." Sarah nodded, her eyes still on the treeline. "I just hope it's enough." The days following Ash's return to the pack were bittersweet for Sarah. The camp, once alive with the pup's playful energy, now felt emptier, quieter. Yet Sarah found solace in knowing Ash was where he belonged. She buried herself in her research, hiking deeper into the Rockies to collect data and observe wildlife. It was during one of these outings that she stumbled upon something chilling. A series of crude steel traps had been set along a narrow trail, their teeth sharp and menacing. Sarah's stomach turned as she knelt to examine them. The traps were old but functional, hidden skillfully beneath layers of leaves and moss. Nearby, she found a discarded can of beer and cigarette butts, signs that the perpetrators were close. Her radio crackled as Ben's voice broke through. "Sarah, you coming back soon? Weather's about to turn." "I found something," Sarah replied, her voice tense. "Traps, and fresh signs of hunters." There was a pause. "You sure? Could just be leftovers from a while back." "No," Sarah said firmly. "These are recent. Someone's out here, and they're targeting the wolves." Back at camp, Sarah gathered the team to discuss her findings. The mood was tense as she laid out the traps she'd dismantled. Ben frowned, his arms crossed. "We knew this was a risk. Hunters have always been a problem in these parts." Ellie, sitting cross-legged near the fire, looked uneasy. "But this isn't just random. They're going after wolves specifically." "That's illegal." "Illegal doesn't stop everyone," Sarah said, her voice laced with frustration. "We need to report this." Ben sighed. "And say what? That we found some traps? Without catching them in the act? It's just circumstantial." Sarah's green eyes flashed with determination. "So we catch them, or at least document enough evidence to force an investigation." Ben shook his head. That's dangerous, Sarah. These people aren't going to back down just because you ask them to. I'm not asking them, Sarah said firmly. I'm protecting the wolves, and I won't stand by while they're hunted. Later that evening, as the camp settled into a tense quiet, Sarah stayed awake by the fire, her thoughts racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, not just for the wolves, but for Ash and his pack. The image of the little pup, once fragile and scared, now thriving with his family, fueled her resolve. The next day, Sarah ventured out alone, determined to follow the trail she'd found. The air was crisp, and the forest seemed unusually silent, as if it, too, sensed the threat. She moved cautiously, her senses heightened, until she stumbled upon a small clearing. There, she saw them. Two men, their rifles slung over their shoulders, inspecting another series of traps. Their voices were low, but carried an edge of arrogance. "Did you see the size of that black one last time?" one of them said, his voice tinged with excitement. "Bet he'd fetch a good price." Sarah's blood ran cold. They were talking about the alpha. Clenching her jaw, she pulled out her phone and began recording, careful to stay hidden. The men moved methodically, resetting traps and marking trees with bright orange spray paint. Suddenly, a twig snapped beneath Sarah's boot. Both men froze, their heads snapping in her direction. "Who's there?" one barked, raising his rifle. Sarah ducked behind a tree, her heart pounding. She held her breath, willing herself to remain calm. After a tense moment, the men muttered something about a deer and continued their work, but Sarah knew she couldn't risk staying longer. When she returned to camp, breathless and shaken, she showed the team the footage. Ben's expression darkened as he watched. "This is enough to go to the authorities," he admitted. "But it's going to take time for them to act." "We don't have time," Sarah said. "They're after the alpha and the pack. We have to warn them." Ellie looked at Sarah with wide eyes. "How do you warn wolves, Sarah?" Sarah set her jaw. "By making sure they're not here when the hunters come back." The plan was risky and uncertain, but Sarah had made up her mind. She wasn't just a scientist observing nature. She was its protector. The wolves had trusted her once. Now, it was her turn to repay that trust. The next morning, the camp buzzed with a mixture of anxiety and urgency. Sarah stood at the center, her map of the Rockies spread across a makeshift table. Her fingers traced the rugged paths and narrow trails, her mind racing to find a route that would give the wolves a chance to evade the hunters. The team gathered around her, their faces reflecting the weight of the situation. "There's a high ridge here," Sarah began, pointing to a jagged line on the map. "It's steep, but it's remote. If we can guide the wolves toward it, the hunters won't be able to follow easily." Ben leaned over, his brow furrowed. "That's rough terrain, Sarah, even for wolves." "They're built for it," Sarah countered, "and it's their best chance. We can't just sit here and hope the authorities act in time." Ellie nodded, her expression resolute. "I'm with Sarah. If anyone can lead them safely, it's her." Ben sighed heavily, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fine, but this isn't just about terrain. Those hunters are armed and dangerous. If they catch us out there, they won't," Sarah said, her voice steady. "We'll move quickly and stay out of sight." As the plan took shape, Sarah packed her essentials: a lightweight pack with water, first aid supplies, and a GPS device. She also carried a signal flare, a precaution in case things went wrong. By mid-afternoon, she was ready. Before leaving, she turned to the team. "If I'm not back by sundown tomorrow, get the footage to the authorities. And don't come looking for me." Ben frowned. "Sarah, I mean it," she interrupted. "This isn't about me. It's about them." With that, she set off into the forest, her determination outweighing her fear. The air was crisp and cool, the towering pines casting long shadows across the uneven ground. Sarah moved with purpose, her boots crunching softly on the forest floor. It didn't take long to find signs of the pack. Fresh tracks and tufts of fur marked their passage, leading her deeper into the wilderness. She followed cautiously, her heart pounding with the urgency of her mission. Hours later, she found them. The alpha stood at the edge of a rocky clearing, his massive black form silhouetted against the fading light. The rest of the pack lingered nearby, their movements fluid and alert. Ash, now stronger and more confident, bounded toward her with a joyful yip. "Hey, buddy," Sarah said softly, crouching to meet him. Ash nuzzled her hand, his amber eyes shining with recognition, but there was no time for sentiment. She looked up at the Alpha, her voice steady but urgent. "You're in danger. We need to move." The Alpha watched her intently, his piercing gaze filled with a quiet understanding. Sarah didn't know how much he comprehended, but she trusted his instincts. She gestured toward the ridge in the distance. "That way. It's safe." To her astonishment, the Alpha seemed to respond. He turned to the pack, letting out a low, commanding growl. The wolves began to move, their coordinated movements a testament to their unity. Ash lingered by Sarah's side, his loyalty unwavering. As they climbed the ridge, the terrain became increasingly difficult. Loose rocks and steep inclines tested even Sarah's endurance. But the wolves moved with a natural grace, their bodies built for the rugged landscape. Sarah marveled at their resilience, even as fatigue threatened to overtake her. When they reached the summit, Sarah paused to catch her breath. The view was breathtaking. The sprawling forest below bathed in the golden hues of sunset. But the moment of peace was short-lived. In the distance, she spotted movement, two figures moving steadily through the trees. The hunters. Her heart clenched as she realized how close they were. She turned to the Alpha, her voice urgent. "We have to keep going." The pack moved quickly, their instincts driving them forward. Sarah stayed at the rear, her eyes scanning the forest for any sign of pursuit. The hunters were persistent, but the steep terrain slowed them considerably. As night fell, the pack reached a dense thicket on the other side of the ridge. It was the perfect hiding spot, its tangled vegetation providing both cover and safety. Sarah stopped, her chest heaving from exertion. She turned to the Alpha, her voice filled with quiet determination. "You'll be safe here." The Alpha stepped forward, his massive form towering over her. For a moment, they stood in silence, their eyes meeting. Then, in a gesture that took Sarah by surprise, he lowered his head slightly, as if acknowledging her efforts. Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them away. "Take care of them," she whispered. Ash nudged her hand one last time before turning to join the pack. Sarah watched as they disappeared into the thicket, their forms melting into the shadows. She stayed for a moment longer, listening to the night sounds of the forest, before making her way back toward camp. Exhausted but relieved, Sarah knew the wolves had a chance now. But the danger wasn't over yet. The hunters were still out there, and the fight for the wolves' safety was far from finished. The trek back to camp was grueling, but Sarah's mind raced faster than her steps. She couldn't shake the sight of the hunters moving through the trees, their rifles slung casually but menacingly over their shoulders. She needed to act quickly. The wolves might have a temporary reprieve, but the hunters wouldn't stop until they succeeded. As Sarah neared camp, she radioed Ben. "I need you to prepare the evidence we have. The hunters are closing in on the wolves' location." Ben's voice crackled through the static. "Are you okay? Did they see you?" "No, but they're too close for comfort," Sarah replied, her voice tight with urgency. "We have to stop them before they get any closer." By the time Sarah arrived at camp, night had fully descended, and a cold wind rustled the trees. The team gathered around her, their expressions a mix of concern and determination. Ellie handed her a mug of steaming coffee, her voice hesitant. "What's the plan, Sarah?" Sarah set the mug down without drinking. "We're going to lead the hunters into a trap of our own." Ben frowned. "Sarah, this is getting reckless. These men are armed and dangerous, and they're breaking the law," Sarah shot back. "We can't let them get away with this." Ellie nodded in agreement. "She's right. We have the footage, but if we can catch them in the act, it'll seal the case." Ben sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Fine. What do you need from us?" Sarah laid out her plan. Using the GPS coordinates from her earlier trek, she identified a narrow gorge where the hunters would likely pass. The terrain was treacherous, making it easier to corner them. Sarah would lead them toward the gorge while the rest of the team stayed hidden, ready to alert the authorities at the right moment. Early the next morning, Sarah retraced her steps to the ridge. Her pulse quickened when she spotted the hunters again, their voices carrying through the crisp air. She crouched behind a boulder, watching as they examined another series of traps. One of them, a wiry man with a scruffy beard, spat on the ground. Still no sign of the pack. They've got to be close. His companion, a bulkier man with a shaved head, grunted. They'll slip up. Wolves always do. Sarah's fingers tightened around the radio in her hand. She whispered into it. They're moving east. I'm following. Ben's voice came through, steady but concerned. Be careful. We've got your back. Sarah began her descent, moving stealthily through the underbrush. The hunters continued their trek, oblivious to her presence. When they reached the edge of the gorge, Sarah stepped into view, her heart pounding. That's far enough, she said, her voice firm. The hunters whirled around, their faces darkening with recognition. The wiry man smirked. You again. You just can't mind your own business, can you? Sarah's jaw tightened. This is my business. What you're doing is illegal, and I won't let you harm these wolves. The bulkier man stepped forward, his hand resting on the rifle slung across his chest. You think you can stop us? You're just a scientist. I've already stopped you, Sarah replied, holding up her phone. Everything you've done is on camera, and the authorities are on their way. The wiry man's smirk faltered, replaced by a scowl. You're bluffing. Sarah didn't flinch. Try me. The tension was palpable as the two sides stared each other down. Just as the wiry man started to move, a low growl echoed from the shadows. The hunters froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. From the dense foliage, the alpha emerged, his black fur bristling and his yellow eyes locked on the intruders. Behind him, the rest of the pack appeared, their movements coordinated and deliberate. Ash stood at the alpha's side, his tail high and his stance confident. The hunters, faced with a dozen wolves, began to backpedal. This isn't over. The bulky man growled, but his bravado was gone. No, Sarah said firmly. It is. At that moment, the distant wail of sirens broke the tension. The hunters exchanged panicked looks before bolting, but they didn't get far. Minutes later, law enforcement vehicles screeched to a halt, blocking the trail. Officers emerged, weapons drawn, and quickly subdued the fleeing men. Sarah let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through her. The wolves lingered at the edge of the clearing, watching the scene unfold. The alpha locked eyes with Sarah one last time, his gaze conveying a quiet acknowledgement before he turned and led the pack back into the forest. As the officers secured the hunters, one of them approached Sarah. We've been after these guys for months. You did good, ma'am. Sarah nodded, exhaustion catching up to her. I just wanted to protect them. You did more than that, Ben said as he approached. You gave them a chance to survive. As Sarah watched the wolves disappear into the wilderness, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The fight wasn't over. There was still much to do to protect their habitat. But for now, the pack was safe, and that was enough. The morning air was crisp and filled with the hum of activity as law enforcement and wildlife officials combed the area. The hunters, now handcuffed and subdued, sat sullenly under the watchful eyes of the officers. Their rifles and traps had been collected as evidence, their illegal activities finally brought to a halt. Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing, her arms crossed as she spoke with Officer Daniels, a ranger assigned to the case. Daniels, a man in his early 40s with a rugged face and sharp eyes, nodded as Sarah recounted her experiences. You're lucky they didn't catch you first, he said, his tone a mixture of admiration and concern. These guys have been on our radar for a while, but we didn't have enough to nail them until now. Sarah handed him her phone, which contained the footage of the hunters resetting their traps and discussing their intentions. This should seal the deal. They didn't even try to hide what they were doing. Daniels took the phone and shook his head. This is more than enough. You did good, Sarah. This will go a long way in protecting the wolves. Ben and Ellie joined Sarah as the officers loaded the hunters into their vehicles. Ben handed Sarah a steaming cup of coffee. You know, he said with a smirk, for someone who spends most of her time studying plants and animals, you're pretty good at taking down criminals. Sarah chuckled, though her exhaustion was evident. I'm just glad it's over. At least for now. Ellie, ever the optimist, grinned. And the wolves? They're safe, right? Sarah looked toward the forest, where the pack had disappeared hours earlier. For now, yes. But their safety isn't just about stopping hunters. It's about ensuring they have a habitat where they can thrive. Daniels overheard and nodded. And that's where we come in. We've already initiated steps to expand protections in this area. This incident will only strengthen our case. The relief was palpable among the team as the vehicles pulled away, leaving the clearing quiet once more. The sense of victory, however, was tempered by the weight of the work still ahead. Sarah knew the fight for conservation was ongoing, but this was a step in the right direction. That evening, the team gathered around the campfire for what felt like the first time in weeks. The air was filled with the smoky aroma of pine wood, and the crackling fire cast warm light on their tired but satisfied faces. Ben raised a mug of coffee in a mock toast. To Sarah, who somehow managed to wrangle wolves, outsmart hunters, and still make it back in one piece. Sarah rolled her eyes but smiled. It was a team effort. Ellie grinned. Sure, but we all know who the wolves trust the most. The mention of the wolves brought a bittersweet pang to Sarah's chest. She stared into the fire, her thoughts drifting to Ash and the pack. She hoped they were far away, deep in the safety of the wilderness. As if on cue, a distant howl echoed through the night. It was soft but clear, carrying a note of familiarity. Sarah's head snapped up, her heart skipping a beat. The howl was followed by another, closer this time. The team fell silent, their eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. From the shadows, a pair of glowing amber eyes appeared, followed by a small, familiar figure. Ash stepped into the clearing, his tail wagging hesitantly as he approached Sarah. Behind him, the alpha lingered at the edge of the woods, watching silently. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she knelt, her voice barely a whisper. Ash! The pup bounded toward her, nuzzling her hand as if to say thank you. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she stroked his fur, the bond between them as strong as ever. She looked up at the alpha, who held her gaze for a long moment before disappearing into the forest. Ben broke the silence with a low whistle. Looks like someone came back to say goodbye. Ellie sniffled, wiping her eyes. I can't handle this. It's too perfect. Sarah smiled through her tears. It's not goodbye, she said softly. It's a reminder. They're still out there, and it's up to us to make sure they stay safe. As Ash turned and trotted back toward the forest, Sarah watched until he vanished into the shadows. The night felt quieter than before, but also more hopeful. The fight to protect the wolves wasn't over, but in that moment, Sarah knew she had made a difference, not just for Ash and his pack, but for the future of the wilderness she loved. The events in the Rockies marked a turning point in Sarah's life and work. The footage she captured and the arrest of the hunters not only garnered attention from law enforcement, but also from conservation organizations across the country. Within weeks, Sarah found herself at the center of a growing movement to protect the wolves and their habitat. Back at the university where Sarah worked, the team held a meeting in her honor. The modest conference room buzzed with energy as colleagues, students, and local activists gathered to hear her story. A projector displayed images of the wolves, the traps she dismantled, and the breathtaking wilderness of the Rockies. Dr. Patel, the head of Sarah's department, opened the meeting with a proud smile. Sarah's bravery and dedication have not only advanced our understanding of the ecosystem, but have also set a powerful example of what it means to protect it. Sarah stood, her nerves buzzing as the room quieted. Thank you, Dr. Patel, and thank you all for being here. This isn't just my story, it's the wolves' story. They're a vital part of the Rockies, and their survival is tied to the health of the entire ecosystem. She clicked to the next slide, showing Ash's wide amber eyes staring into the camera. This pup reminded me of why I chose this path. Every life, no matter how small or wild, has value. But the threats they face, illegal hunting, habitat loss, climate change, are immense. That's why we need action. The room erupted into applause as Sarah concluded her presentation, but the work was just beginning. Fueled by the momentum, she proposed a bold initiative, the Rocky Mountain Wolf Conservation Project. The plan combined research, education, and advocacy to ensure the wolves' long-term survival. Sarah reached out to partners across the country, from wildlife organizations to local ranchers. She knew the challenges would be significant. Ranchers often viewed wolves as threats to livestock, and balancing conservation with human interests was no small feat. One evening, Sarah met with a rancher named Jack McAllister, whose sprawling property bordered the wolves' territory. Jack, a man in his 60s with weathered hands and a sharp gaze, greeted her with skepticism. "You're asking me to protect the very thing that's been killing my sheep," he said, his tone blunt. Sarah nodded, her voice steady. "I understand your frustration, Jack, and I'm not here to dismiss it. But wolves are a natural part of this ecosystem, and there are ways to coexist. Non-lethal deterrence, compensation programs. There are solutions." Jack leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You really believe that?" "I do," Sarah said earnestly, "and I'm willing to work with you to find what works best for your ranch." After hours of discussion, Jack agreed to trial some of the proposed methods, including installing motion-activated lights and securing his sheep in predator-proof enclosures. It was a small victory, but it marked the start of a fragile but necessary alliance. Meanwhile, Sarah and her team launched a public outreach campaign. They visited schools, hosted workshops, and organized community events to raise awareness about the wolves' role in maintaining ecological balance. One memorable event featured a life-size sculpture of a wolf made entirely of recycled materials, symbolizing the connection between conservation and sustainability. Months turned into a year, and the project gained traction. Grants and donations poured in, enabling the team to expand their efforts. Satellite tracking collars were deployed on key members of the pack, allowing researchers to monitor their movements and adapt strategies accordingly. Local communities began to see the benefits of coexistence, from increased tourism to healthier ecosystems. One sunny afternoon, Sarah returned to the Rockies with a group of volunteers to check on the wolves' progress. As she hiked through the familiar trails, she marveled at the changes. The forest felt alive with activity. Deer grazed in the meadows, birds flitted through the trees, and wolf tracks crisscrossed the damp soil. At the edge of a clearing, Sarah stopped, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing tall and proud, was the alpha, his black fur gleaming in the sunlight. Beside him was Ash, now larger and stronger, his tail wagging as he recognized her. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she crouched, her voice soft. "Hello, old friend." Ash trotted toward her, his amber eyes filled with a warmth that felt almost human. He nudged her hand, his body pressing against hers in a gesture of trust and gratitude. Sarah laughed through her tears, stroking his fur. "You're doing well," she whispered. "I'm so proud of you." The alpha watched from a distance, his gaze steady. After a moment, he let out a low howl, echoed by the rest of the pack. Sarah stood, her heart swelling with emotion as she listened to the hauntingly beautiful sound. As the wolves disappeared into the forest, Sarah turned to the volunteers, her voice filled with determination. "This is why we fight. For them, for the land, for the future." The Rocky Mountain Wolf Conservation Project was no longer just an initiative, it was a legacy. And Sarah, with her unwavering spirit and love for the wild, had become its heart and soul. Months passed, and the Rocky Mountain Wolf Conservation Project flourished. Sarah's work gained recognition beyond the scientific community, earning her invitations to speak at conferences and collaborate on wildlife protection policies. But for Sarah, the most rewarding part of her work was the growing sense of harmony between the wolves and the people who shared their land. One autumn morning, she found herself back in the Rockies, this time accompanying a group of students on a field excursion. The air was crisp, and the leaves had turned vibrant shades of orange and gold. The group hiked through the familiar trails, pausing to examine tracks, plants, and signs of wildlife. "Wolves are keystone predators," Sarah explained as they stopped near a stream. "Their presence helps regulate prey populations, which in turn allows vegetation to thrive. It's all connected." A young girl raised her hand. "Is it true you saved a wolf pack here?" Sarah smiled. "I played a part, but the real heroes are the wolves themselves. They've adapted and survived against incredible odds." As they continued, Sarah felt a familiar pull toward a specific clearing, the place where she had first encountered the pack. She hadn't been back since that day, but something about it called to her. Excusing herself from the group, she walked ahead, her heart pounding with anticipation. When she reached the clearing, the sight that greeted her stopped her in her tracks. There, standing at the edge of the trees, was Ash. He had grown into a magnificent wolf, his gray coat thick and shining, his amber eyes as sharp as ever. Behind him, the alpha watched, his imposing presence unchanged. Sarah's breath caught, and a wide smile spread across her face. "Ash," she whispered, her voice breaking. Ash padded toward her, his movements fluid and confident. When he reached her, he nuzzled her hand, just as he had so many times before. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she knelt, wrapping her arms around him. "You're amazing," she murmured. "Look at you." The alpha let out a low growl, not one of threat, but of acknowledgement. Sarah met his gaze and nodded. "Thank you for trusting me," she said softly. "For trusting us." Ash lingered for a moment longer before stepping back toward his pack. He paused once, looking at Sarah with a gaze that seemed to hold the weight of all their shared moments, then turned and disappeared into the forest with the alpha. Sarah stayed in the clearing for a long time, the echoes of the wolf's presence filling her with a profound sense of peace. When she finally rejoined the group, her students noticed the tears on her cheeks. "Are you okay?" one of them asked. Sarah nodded, her smile radiant. "I've never been better." The encounter with Ash stayed with her, a reminder of the bond they had formed and the journey they had shared. It was a rare and beautiful gift, one she would carry for the rest of her life. As the years passed, the Rocky Mountain Wolf Conservation Project continued to thrive, becoming a model for similar efforts worldwide. Sarah remained at the helm, her passion undiminished. And though she often thought of Ash and his pack, she never sought them out. She trusted they were where they belonged, free, wild, and thriving in the heart of the Rockies. On quiet evenings, when the wind carried the faintest echoes of howls through the mountains, Sarah would smile and whisper, "Thank you, Ash, for everything." And she knew, deep in her heart, that the wolves were howling their gratitude right back. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. If you watched all the way through, comment, "I watched all the way through," and share your thoughts about this story. Oh, and don't forget to check out the next video that appears on the end screen. It's incredibly exciting.